In the interest of time, as people are signing in, we're going to get started on time. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar, Essential AI Strategies to Strengthen Third-Party Risk Management. We're excited to have you join us for today's discussion on how AI is transforming third-party risk management. We'd like this to be an interactive session, so we encourage you to enter your questions right in the Q&A, and we'll address them as part of today's discussion. To kick things off, I'd like to introduce ASMGI's President and CEO, Steve Racing. Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Gail. And thank all of you for sharing some of your time with us today. Thanks for being with us, Linda.
My pleasure.
Always great. We have a great topic today and great panelists. The topic is AI strategies to help third-party risk management, and the panelist, I already said thank you, Linda, for being with us. It's great to have you here.
Well, thanks, and thank you for having me back. I really appreciate it, and I'm a big fan of yours, as you well know. So it's a mutual admiration society. Thank you.
Awesome. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We'll give a little background on ASMGI and Third Party Risk Institute, and we're going to try something different. Today, Linda's going to do the stats instead of me, and then we'll ask some panelist questions, and then we'll open it up for some audience questions, and then we'll do a conclusion and some closing remarks. So from a background standpoint, we basically cover the entire North America continent. We have SOCs or staff in Cleveland, Raleigh, Trenton, Provo, Toronto, Minneapolis, and San Antonio. We have customers. We have over 700 customers across North America, including in Canada, and over 400 managed service customers. Customers include colleges and universities, financial services, healthcare, manufacturing, legal, and retail. We consider ourselves a consulting and full stack technology company, and what we mean by full stack is that we do pretty much everything, right? So IT and security and software development. So we're proficient at strategy and OKRs, KPIs, cybersecurity operations, managed IT services, and software development. So we look at the world like there are two ways of thinking, the old way and the new way, right? And the old ways we call the point solution mindset. It's characterized by being reactive, focusing on individual things. Like we had a customer once tell us that this is a great solution that you provide, but we're still working on last year's projects. And so what I want to point out is that a lot of people do controls like projects, right? And move on to the next project after they finish the first one. And we think that's not the right way to do it. It's fragmented and inefficient, and the net result of that is you can spend a lot and not necessarily improve outcomes that much. There's a new way of thinking we call the holistic mindset. It's more proactive by nature. It focuses on total solutions. One of the things we have at ASMGI is that total solutions equals the program plus the technology plus the operations. And if you're missing any one of those three, it's not a total solution, right? So anyway, we feel pretty good about that. So, and gets backed up a lot. Oh, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Linda?
Oh, sure. I have been in third-party risk management for quite some time now. In my corporate life, I was chief procurement officer and head of third-party risk in three major financial institutions on four instances, wasn't that nice. One of them had me back 12 years later. Anyhow, so I lead Third Party Risk Institute. Our entire focus is certification and certificate programs to help professionals become better. We talked a little bit, Steve, about being the human in the loop. We hope that some of the learning, certification, and sort of general rounding of knowledge that we can bring to people can help them become that human in the loop. I also written 2 books, Third Party Risk Management, Driving Enterprise Value, which I'm now writing my 3rd edition. And my 2nd book was published by Institute for Internal Auditors. It's a practical guide. So Third Party Risk Management, a practical guide. And I'm very anxious to get through my 3rd edition of my 1st book, because I want to write a 3rd book, which is really that whole overarching governance and management. So address more to senior management and the board. So this is a bit about me. I'm very passionate about this. I've been doing it for a long time, and there's no end of fascination. So thank you.
Awesome. We're going to do some stats on third-party risk.
Okay. So first stat, basically, I looked at this model. Basically, we had no trouble finding stats. Trust me on this. So first thing you look at is you say, oh, that's not good, only 33%. But that actually may be the good news story, because you know that if you try to do everything, you can't do anything well. So this may be either as a result of very good relationship segmentation, so you know what to manage, or it may be at the intake phase, which means they're missing a whole bunch of stuff and don't know. So could be a good news, could be a bad news story. Hard to say. Look at your own organization, you'll know the answer. Okay, so the next one is every one of these things could be true. Why? What's getting in the way of doing a good job at third-party risk management? Everybody has something, right? But why is not effective? Why is it not efficient? So number one reason is barrier. The number one reason why this doesn't happen well is lack of resources. And I go back to that segmentation. If you're not doing that well, chances are pretty high that you don't really know where to spend your time. Nobody has enough resources, trust me. Okay, so yeah. So the next one is, I really like this because I was talking to Steve earlier, and one of my dear friends is Chief Risk Officer for a very important organization. And she observed that mostly what organizations are doing these days is the internal component of their operations is really getting sort of smaller and smaller in proportion to the larger whole, which is their extended enterprise. So we're really in a position now where we actually really do have to know a lot about our third parties, the risks they present, how dependent we are on them, in order to do a good job of managing them. So I thought this was an interesting stat, and I'm not, it may be overstated or understated in some cases, but this 80% increase, I don't think that's going to go away. And the access to the network, this is all about controls, right? So if you don't really know who you're doing business with, you may not, as an organization, know what they have access to. And the fact that 181 of them have access to your network, your data, think about the possibilities. Okay, so that's that one. Okay, so this one is actually, Steve, you and I were talking about this ahead of time. This is kind of a depressing slide in some respects, because it says basically that if you look at the dark line, it's really what are you currently remediating in terms of your practices, right? In comparison to what you're identifying or tracking as a risk. So that tells us that people might be doing a very good job up front at identifying risk, but not necessarily a particularly good job at mitigating, managing, monitoring them. So I didn't think that this was a particularly good news slide.
I don't think so.
Yeah, and this one is kind of interesting too. I mean, as we said, Steve, we just had no trouble finding interesting stats here. So are you using AI? I would say that 61%, you're investigating use cases. Those are the more forward-looking organizations who are recognizing that we don't have enough resources, we're missing a pile of stuff. If you're not looking into use cases for AI in your third-party risk management program, you really actually should be, right? So 25%, so you're getting up to like over 80% are thinking about it. Well, what's holding you up, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about what you might be actually doing, but the fact that only 5% are actively using AI I think we're going to have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by AI? But we'll do that later. Okay, so this one is also an interesting set of statistics. So, why are you using this? So if you're using it in third-party risk management, I mean, the most obvious use case is let's do something to deal with that big choke point, which is due diligence and evaluation of third-party controls. So if you're only thinking like half the time you can speed up, let me assure you are dead wrong. If you use AI-enabled technologies during your due diligence, I can assure you that a lot more than 58% are going to get, sort of better outcomes. And so why do you have no strategy? I don't know about you. I know as a leader and a corporate executive, I didn't wait for somebody to tell me how to run my business, right? That's my job to figure out how to run my business. So I think that the fact that there's no organizational strategy for AI, as long as nobody's standing on your, on your tail there, telling you cannot move forward, you should be looking at this and you should be actually figuring out where the safe use cases. So yeah, definitely get on this, guys. Okay, this is a nice stat. So this I was thinking about, sort of when it comes down to the security side of things. I mean, I can't even imagine any organization out there that doesn't have a cyber strategy for their third-party risk. I mean, they wouldn't be in business anymore if that's the case, because they would have already been scooped up by ransomware or something, something horrible. So the cost savings are really important, because the threat landscape, I mean, that's kind of this broad, kind of a nebulous term, but the number of threats coming into organizations every day is just getting, those guys out there, the bad guys, are getting better and better. I mean, it's easy to fall for things. So if you're not using AI to help prevent these attacks, then you're leaving a lot of money on the table, because when they happen, and they will, and you have a risk event, you're going to end up paying a lot more money than if you used AI to help you get there. So yeah, so I like this slide a lot. Okay. This one makes me laugh. If only 87%, only 87% have detected security issues in their software supply chain, I would have to say there's somebody asleep at the wheel at 13% of companies out there. Don't you think that's true, Steve? There's no possibilities. Only 80%, 87% have detected. So what's wrong with the rest of you? That's what I want to know. So don't let that be you. Okay, so the stats basically say that, it's kind of interesting that 50% of companies use contractors and third parties to create software. So all I could have to say to that is, have you ever heard of SolarWinds? Right? That's a very, very good example of how much harm can be caused by using a third or fourth party to develop software without adequate security around it. So this is really, that's a cautionary tale for anybody. And so 65%, they say they do not have a mature software supply chain security program. And I would have to say that number is very much understated. I'm assuming it's because they've never heard of SBOMs, software bill of materials, and what you do with that, because even big companies are still learning that. And last but not least, that of course, software supply chain presents risk, right? It presents risk to a lot more than 88%. So I'm not entirely thrilled by some of these stats, Steve. I think that some of them, people, they just don't understand. That's all I can think of. Okay, so that's it for our slides. I hope you like them. If anybody's got better stats, please send them our way, because we're always looking for interesting material. So we post, my organization posts 3 times a week on LinkedIn. We're always looking for great material. So if you have anything, send it to me. I'll attribute it to you if you like.
Awesome. Thanks, Linda. Now we're going to ask you some questions.
Okay, I can't wait. I obviously have opinions. Okay, can I explain this picture? Okay, I like this picture because it really, I put this together to try and explain what third-party risk management is all about. So if you look at basically the outside of the frame, the top and the bottom are basically, why do we do what we do? Well, we're trying to create risk insight so that the organization can make risk-informed decisions. It's not that we're, unwilling to take on risk. is that if you don't have the right information, you don't know how much risk or the types of risks, right? So then it's basically, this is sort of bookended by your business strategy on one end and your risk appetite on the other. So your business strategy is inexplicably, like, there's inseparable from your risk appetite, or it should be. And a lot of people have trouble defining risk appetite because most organizations say the risk appetite is moderate to low, or it's low. And yet we take on many, many risky relationships. And that's why it's back to make a risk-informed decision, because you are going to take on high levels of risk that are going to exceed your risk appetite. So the next layer in, or the gray box, is basically what should your program look like? So the top and the bottom are through a risk specialist lens. It should be risk-centric, which means do things that actually help you identify and manage risk. And you'd be surprised how often I see things in programs that don't do that, or they're extraneous. And the second is risk adjusted. You remember that stat about the resources. If you don't, nobody has enough resources. So if you don't risk adjust, which is making sure your work effort is commensurate with the risk and the operational dependency, you'll either over or underdo it. And so, and then your two bookends are basically your lens of audit, right? They want it to be complete and they want it to be compliant, because you will have policies and maybe regulations, but certainly laws you have to comply with. And the inside box, identify, assess, manage, and monitor, that's lifecycle management, right? That's what we do to serve all these masters. So I hope you like it. I mean, it's hard to explain third-party risk sometimes, right?
I think so. So how does AI help identify and mitigate hidden risks?
Well, I think this is a really big question. So the first thing that I would think of is, do you understand what AI is? So I've been giving a few talks lately because I kind of realized that we talk about it without necessarily understanding what it truly means. So to me, it's like thinking about a three-legged stool. And so you've got technologies, right? So there's some of them are tried and true. We understand them. We've been using them for years. That's basically one leg of the stool. The next leg of the stool is, well, what makes them run, right? It is the models and the algorithms that make these things work, right? Because the tech unto itself is not AI, but tech plus models, algorithms, and the software that makes it run basically put together create an AI solution. And last but not least is all the things that have to go into it, which is your data, your models, all those types of things to make it work for your organization. So asking AI to help identify and mitigate hidden risks is a really good idea. You know, I don't know about you, but having been out and about quite a bit lately, I try to talk to people every day, at least somebody I consider a thought leadership type, person I want to know. I'm trying to find out what the use cases are. And what I find is really interesting is that the use cases in third-party risk management, or even risk management, are somewhat limited, right? We see it deployed in cybersecurity. And I think, Steve, you're probably better equipped to talk to the cybersecurity opportunities than I am. But what I do know is that there's a lot of toes in the water, but there's not necessarily a lot of use cases that people are willing to talk about if they're using it. So where I think it really makes a lot of sense, where I'm seeing a lot more traction, is actually inside organizations that have licensed an AI tool of some sort. And now they're using it internally to help them actually identify and mitigate the hidden risks, right? Because imagine doing a much better job of understanding who was in your systems, what access, they had to different data, what controls you have around various aspects of your technology or your data or your people, et cetera. Those are really good uses of AI. And I think that what it does do is it's sensible, right? People are using the technology inside their own environment to understand the risks in the environment. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Yeah. Are you seeing that as well, Steve, where the use is more internal to their own environment?
I think it's more internal.
Yeah.
That's what I see. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, because when we start to use it in the outside world to identify and mitigate hidden risks, I think those use cases are going to come to the table very soon, but they're not necessarily there yet. I think we're all worried about AI and quantum computing, et cetera. and trying to figure out how do we protect our own environment. I think that's a sensible use of this. What I would caution people is that if you're licensing an AI tool, don't forget that it is a compilation of technology and models. And I think what's really important when you're going through your sourcing and selection process for these tools is that you understand to the best of your ability how they work. Because if you don't understand that, I think that the chance that you're going to use this use the tool in a thoughtful way that it really make a big difference in your organization, you actually could get some nasty surprises. So if I go back to the technologies, I'm just going to look here in the background. I've been, kind of working on this. And so there's a few, there's a big long list, right? There's things that we know: machine learning, deep learning, what they call fuzzy logic, natural language processing, robotic process and automation. There's newer technologies called computer visioning, artificial neural networks, evolutionary computing, multi-core computing, etc. And so, and I forgot large language models, which we kind of know. So when you put the pieces together, trying to understand how it works is actually not easy. And I don't understand this. I have actually never, ever seen a technology risk assessment that is in common practice, unlike NIST or there's a lot of frameworks out there that are developed by ISO and NIST and other organizations. They've never put one together for technology risk, which I don't understand. Anyhow, that aside, so you want to understand what the tech is, and then you understand what the models are, right? Because the models are the secret sauce of these organizations. But don't forget, they probably rushed this product to market, right? Because we're all out there trying to compete. So you need to understand basically what are the statistical learning? How do they train it? How do you train it? Where are the algorithms buried in it? And how many of them are meta algorithms, which is an algorithm supporting an algorithm supporting an algorithm, like they're all bundled together. I think that trying to unpack it before you decide whether it's going to help you mitigate or at the same time as you're figuring out can mitigate your hidden risks, is probably a good use of your time. But we're still learning, so it's going to take time.
Awesome. Thanks. So what are some strategies for improving operational resilience?
Okay, so I think it goes back to the fundamentals of third-party risk management, right? So third-party risk management is a combination of processes, as you said, and also underlying methodologies. So in order to improve our operational resilience, I think it starts with having a good relationship segmentation framework, right? That's your intake process to understand what risks you're facing and how dependent your organization is on the third party. Without having a good relationship segmentation framework during intake, I think that you're going to get bogged down, because I go back to that first stat, that could be good or bad. I'll be honest, if it is in fact managed third parties, right, of your whole population, 33% would be a high number. Because if you did a good job during intake to identify the amount of operational dependency and the amount of risk you're exposed to, or risks that you want to manage, 33% of your whole population is much larger than I would expect, right? So that anything, we're seeing 15 to 20 in well-managed mature programs for most organizations, because you can't manage everything, right? So, and that the work effort should be commensurate with that. So you can't get to operational resilience, which is not a fancy way of saying business continuity management, without understanding the population of third parties and where you're going to spend your work effort. So then you've decided to make use of AI. I think that what you can use AI for is all kinds of interesting things. I mean, think about in the medical profession, you could use it to assist you in an operation. Why would you not use the technology to help you stress test some of your server farm? Or why wouldn't you use it to determine, sort of what you're exposed to in terms of fraud risk? I mean, fraud risk is a really good use of this. So there's many different strategies I can think of for improving, but it's going to be case specific for each organization and what they feel comfortable with. Because you think of that slide where a lot of organizations they're just thinking about it, they're not doing. And so what's getting in the way? I think it's this whole operational resilience is it's a new concept. in risk management. And it's something that's fairly elusive, but that's raison d'etre, right? You manage risk so you improve resilience. So I'm kind of rambling on that because there's so many use cases. I don't know where to settle. So what do you think, Steve?
I think to create operational resilience, you have to do something for sure. And it should be something that maintains your operational resilience.
Yeah, so it has to be intentional, right? So if you go back to understanding that your organization, so depending on what industry you're in, if you're in, say, oil and gas, you're exposed to to corruption, right? Fraud and corruption are two things that can really cause you pain when you're dealing with your third parties. That's where you're going to put your energy basically to help you detect those things. So you think of oil and gas or a mining company, they're out in the field and they've got a lot of their procurement and their payments are in cash in especially in some parts of the world. And you're relying very often on a third party to dispense that cash on your behalf. So you could use AI in this case to help protect your organization by looking for anomalies or patterns in fraud. So having been a chief procurement officer for a long time in organizations, I remember in one of our offshore organizations, I just caught wind of things that didn't make sense, right? But if you had a better way of looking at the bills that you were paying, the invoices coming in, et cetera, your chances are pretty good that you're going to be able to detect fraud and corruption. I mean, I can think of one of my friends who was in a similar role in a third world country, and he started looking at all the incoming invoices, by hand. And that sure slowed some of them down, right? Certain types of invoices that were repetitive and unclear. Why wouldn't you use AI to do that screening for you? Because it's really, what does AI do well, right? It can't replace people yet, no matter what you think. So it's very good at analytical, right? So it's pattern detection, which can lead to fraud detection. Pattern detection, which can lead to, do you have an employee or an employee at a third party where there are certain types of transactions that seem suspicious, right? Because a control is sort of second set of eyes. Well, why wouldn't the first set of eyes be AI and the second set of eyes be a trusted individual or individuals to look at those transactions, right? So you have to look at what it does well and how it can look at small components of operational resilience, because trying to tackle the whole thing doesn't work. So I think if you look at your industry and the sector you're in, you're going to be able to determine where are some of the repetitive tasks where it does require some sort of manual or some sort of work effort to get the data and do the analytics so you can decide what to do, right? You can use AI to do those types of tasks. And that's why we could come up with 100,000 use cases and none at the same time, because this is a broad topic.
It's a good topic, though.
It is.
What about compliance?
Oh, I think this is so undertapped. I mean, one of the things I often get, so I in the certified third party risk management professional program, I get part of what you have to do is post questions and answers, right, to yourself, to other students and faculty. One of the questions I get all the time is, how do we stay on top of regulations, changing regulations and laws in all the jurisdictions where we operate? And I can assure you, having been a corporate executive, this is difficult to do. So one of the things you can think about is actually using some sort of AI tool to help you keep track of these things, and also to look at maybe a comparison of your own internal exams, right? Examinations where there's been findings or audit findings, and it can parse this information down, right? Remember that sort of matching and pattern matching, et cetera, can start to isolate areas where you should spend work effort to do a better job complying. We also know that there are vendors and there's non-vendors in your third-party population. And I know that may sound kind of silly, but there's, what do you call all those others that are not in your accounts payable system, but you're reliant on them? So everybody uses payment process, right? I use them, you probably use them. they're not a vendor, right? You're not paying them exactly, or you may be through credit card fees, but there's all kinds of, there's a huge population in most organizations of not vendors. They're not going through accounts payable that you actually are reliant on to do business. So trying to wrap your arms around what the compliance requirements are for them is actually very, very difficult. And I think that for any company out there listening, there's an excellent use case here to help actually create the governance framework and the ability to do some testing on whether or not the individual businesses are following their own governance framework, their own compliance requirements, and appropriately managing their third-party population, because that's very, very tough to do from the center. It's easier with vendors. I mean, even though they're all different, they have a lot of the same characteristics. But if you go to a business unit, I mean, I come from banking, right? So one has wire transfer partners like Swift, et cetera. Another one has correspondent banking. Another one has a stack of lawyers they rely on. They're not often in the core program, or well, I meant to say they're often not in the core program, but it's part of your completeness in your inventory. So how do you know whether or not they're complying, right, with contractual terms and conditions? How do you know that your own organization is complying with its own policies and governance requirements? There is a huge use case here that would be very easily consumed. And this used to be called RegTech. And I think, I don't know what it's called now, but there's just so many great opportunities on the compliance side.
I agree.
Okay, so some practical tips for reducing third-party risk with AI is, first of all, I think that these organizations present their own type of risk, right? So when you're going through the intake process during selection, what we do know is that the due diligence on a certain new third party is a time-consuming activity that involves a lot of very skilled resources, and your businesses don't want to wait, right? So they're often impatient. So I think that the first thing is to try to find ways to do a better job at speeding up the process for intake. So this is not exactly third-party risk, but it's third-party program management. So there's companies out there. I'm on the advisory board for, can I say the company's name? I'm on an advisory board. Is it okay if I say their name? They're in this.
It's okay.
Okay, so I'm on the advisory board for Halo AI. And the reason why I accepted the position as an advisory board member is because I wanted to see what they're doing. Because due diligence is the number one choke point in third-party risk management, right? You're sending out forms to third parties. They may or may not respond. You may not get what you want. And so it can take weeks and sometimes months to go through due diligence. And that's just not, that doesn't work. So there's a couple of companies on the market, including Halo AI, where you can work with them to set up the control environment or use the one that they have. You can get the third party to send them anything, any type of documentation, their policies, their SOC report, their audit report, anything that is consumable. And you can supplement that with what I call risk intelligence solutions, right? Those financial health models, cyber monitoring companies like yourself, and put that information into the software. And rather than taking a lot of time and effort by your very valuable, scarce resources to go through and do the evaluation. I remember I asked you one time, what do you think the average is for doing the controls evaluation? And your response was between 15 and 25 hours. And I've seen some of them take way longer than that. They can do this in a few minutes, right? So it consumes all the information, looks for the controls, does the matching, and then based on data that they have and controls, et cetera, they will also rate their confidence in whether or not the controls are there and strong, right? So then you take that basically, rather than spending all this time looking for the controls and the documentation, you take the output from that, and now you got your human in the loop, right? So your human in the loop says, okay, where are my high impact controls I truly care about, like network security, application security, HR security, and what's the confidence level those controls are strong? And just focus on the ones that aren't, right? Like this is an exercise that it's mind-bending how much faster you can do this. But this is like early to the party, right? It's not that common yet, but it will be. So that's my number one. Number two, I said during intake, make sure that you can identify the presence of AI and models and what data they're using, and get someone to have a look at it and see if that's okay. If you want to evaluate the quality of the model that's in the technology and you don't have a model risk department, I was looking around because I did a talk to organizations I knew wouldn't have that, right? Banks have model risk departments, most do not. So IBM Watson actually is being used to test models, which is interesting, isn't it? I'm sure there's others out there, but that's the one I ran into. And I thought, yep, you can outsource the model evaluation too. Cool. So anyhow, is that enough?
Yeah.
Okay.
Next question. What are SBOMs and supply chains, software supply chains?
Well, besides being a very fun thing to say, don't you love saying SBOMs? So software bill of materials is something that you should really consider including in your third-party risk management program. So following the SolarWinds incident, where it was determined that a fourth party actually probably was the one that the company that injected malware into the Orion product, which is used for, access management, like a very invasive product. After that, there was an executive order in the US. I don't know if it's still in effect, but a requirement for an SBOM, which is the software supply chain bill of materials. What is in that software? We do know that with most software products, it's like everything else, right? There's component inputs to the overall software product. So the easiest one, tell me how many companies out there actually create their own reporting module for their software. And I would say that's a very rare thing. So it's a very easy example to understand that the software itself has other component pieces in it, and you should know what they are, where they came from, and whether or not you need to do any risk assessment on the organization. And secondarily, you should know whether or not that company did any risk assessment on the organization they are licensing this from. And so with a good SBOM and a good understanding of where the component pieces are coming from, I think there's a much, much greater opportunity to protect your organization from harm. I think this is a good practice. I'm trying to remember what I did. I think I did a fairly lengthy paper on this that I posted, because I was running a roundtable for third-party risk management executives. And this came up and they said, well, we got it. What do we do with it? Right? You do need to know what to do with these things when you get them. And I would highly recommend that the software supply chain bill of materials is also associated with the engagement in your third-party risk management software. Because if there is a known vulnerability or a 0-day that comes up with it, or some sort of risk event, it'd be pretty easy to find out if your organization might have been exposed to the risk. And in the absence of that, you're going to have to wait for somebody to tell you, right? Like your third party you bought the software from in the first place. So this is very, very good practice.
The second part of the question, how do you reduce the impact of software supply chain attacks?
You probably could answer this better than me. But in the long run, I think it's basically, you go back to Warren Buffett, that the greatest risk is the risk of not knowing. Right. So I think that number one is you have to know that the risk is there, but reducing the impact, actually, a lot of it goes back to falling on the shoulders of your risk management professionals, cybersecurity professionals, because when there is a risk event, if they're aware that the risk event may have affected their organization, they can act much more quickly to identify the exposure and to mitigate the risk. So I think that, reducing the impact is all about having good practices to be able to respond quickly to risk events. And if you go back to that slide where we had the $2.2 million reduction in the cost of remediation, if you are using AI to evaluate some of your security requirements, you have a much better chance of responding more quickly, because relying on a person, as we know, is unreliable, and they may not have the bandwidth or be available. So I think using AI to help reduce your exposure and to be able to respond much more quickly to the risks so you can close it down. And then having an excellent risk incident response program is super important. Would you add anything, because this is more your domain than mine?
It's very tough to reduce the impact of supply chain attacks. I know that for a fact.
Yep.
Many companies rely on them and they're secure, right? The company itself is,
Yeah.
not the attackers. But anyway, it's tough.
Yeah. So I honestly think, Steve, that one of the things that organizations should be doing is, especially if they have even if they haven't implemented everything, if they know what good looks like in third-party risk management, they should also be evaluating their third parties' capabilities when it comes to third-party risk management. Because what that does, if your third party you're doing business with has a good program, and a lot of the big fintechs certainly have been forced to have better programs over time, so I'm sure that spreads across a lot of industries. If they have a robust third-party risk management program, that's provided another layer of protection, because now you know that they're managing their third parties who are right? And there's a cascade effect here, because when I hear people telling me that they're evaluating fourth party risk, I know that they're mistaken, right? Because you don't have a contract with the fourth party, the third party, your third party does. And the likelihood you're going to be able to actually get in and do any risk evaluation or controls evaluation is very, very slim. And the only ones I'm aware ever get away with it are ones like, the biggest banks in the US, right? They have the buying power to get through the doors. But in some cases, they even don't. I mean, think about AWS or one of the big tech companies. The biggest banks in the US don't have that kind of buying power, right? Because they are important, but not that important.
Great. We're going to open it up for audience questions. We have several.
Excellent. I'm really glad. Thank you for asking questions.
How can AI help identify and assess third-party risk more effectively than traditional methods?
I think that the use cases aren't yet there. And it's back to looking at the individual risks that your organization is exposed to. So where we know what AI is very good at things like, identifying patterns, doing data analysis. Maybe one of the use cases is back to resilience and risk, is one of the principles of effective third-party risk management and cyber risk management is the need to know, right? So if you look at using AI to supplement your third-party access to data, for example, or to certain databases, that would be a good use case for it. And if you look at the capabilities in terms of matching, right? So if you've got various transactions and you're looking for patterns that might represent either a risk or an anomaly, that's another really good way to use AI. But as a broad brush statement, I think that there's no way to look at this except to look at your own organization and to understand some of the risks that you're facing. Now, when it comes to cyber, I read every day about, I read the headlines. Actually, I subscribe to a cyber risk, a digital publication. I read the headlines every day and decide what I want to read. And we're starting to see more and more use cases where it's being applied to cybersecurity risk. So that's the same thing, detecting, problems, et cetera. Where I think some of the biggest risks are, we're seeing that really phishing and insider risk. Insider threat is one of the biggest threats these days. So I was talking to a professional colleague last week, and she got a text from the CEO asking her something. And she thought, there's just no way that text came from my CEO. So she turned it over to her cyber people, because, even though deep fakes are getting better and better, with phishing, for example, coming from outside the organization, one of the biggest threats we face I don't know about you, Steve, every now and again I fall for something, and then I have a big scramble to change my passwords and all that kind of stuff, because you usually realize it within a very short period of time that one wasn't right. But I would say probably every 6 months I fall for something, right? Which is really annoying thing. Fortunately, none of it's a ransomware yet. So anyhow, but I think it comes back to, on insider threats, where it's phishing or whaling or smishing or whatever we want to call it. I think relying on your cybersecurity people to use AI to try and ferret out, the veracity of those is really important. And I also look at some tools like, some of the tools that you can use also create their own privacy risk, right? I'd love to be able to know whether those phone calls I get where I'm getting voice printed are real or not. And, so I've taken to not saying anything when I answer the phone, which is nuts for a business, don't you think? I wait and see what's going to happen, right? Because I know there's somebody there trying to voice print me. If they don't say hello, they're not actually there. So I think that using some tools to actually to attack, to try and counterattack some of the most vulnerable parts of your organization is super helpful. And I'd love to talk a bit about deepfakes too, because they're like, holy crow. So anyhow, yeah.
What specific AI tools or technologies are most useful for third-party risk?
Well, as I said, I think that one of the best places to start is to look at some of the technologies can help you with the due diligence, right? Because due diligence is a time-consuming process. It consumes valuable resources, and that work can easily be done. That's matching your control requirements with what the third-party documentation or evidence has responded to, and determining whether or not the controls are adequate. I think that's the very, very good use. Also, the risk intelligence solutions that you can subscribe to, I think that they're going to have to go through a bit of a metamorphosis, but they work really well. I've also know that negative news is one heck of a thing to wrap your arm around, right? Whether or not there's something happening with your third party population that you should be concerned about. And I've seen very good use cases there to parse through the news, right? That's on social media and in the news available digitally, to determine whether or not there is something about a third party that would concern your organization. Maybe a cybersecurity breach, maybe a change in senior personnel, etc. Like there are very specific use cases that can just, things that are ugly and you can't really deal with easily, that you could fix pretty easily, right? And then you put the human in the loop, and they have a look at what's found, and then you decide whether or not you need to act, right? That could really, really improve things.
Yep, I agree. What data sources are necessary for AI to be effective in third-party risk?
Well, I think it comes down to the use cases. One of the things that I think you should consider is, I'm this talk I'm doing for IIA, the Institute for Internal Auditors. I want to talk about contracting. So when you are negotiating a contract with a third party that's making use of AI, there's a few things that you really need to be concerned with. So the data sources, you have to be directly involved in determining what data you will expose to an AI tool. The source of the data, because a lot of big companies, their source of truth is not exactly pure, right? It's sometimes the data is not the same in more than one place. So you need to know, it's the need to know data, the data source, how often it's refreshed, how often they look at the models themselves to determine whether or not the models are producing an expected outcome, how they test the models, how you test the models, how you test the output. Those are all those have to go in your contract, or you're not going to be there. You're not going to get what you want. And another thing that I think you should really strongly consider is that you need to know who has the right to turn it off, right? If things are not as expected, if there's something that appears to go sideways. I mean, I think about my early days in one of the projects I had as a chief procurement officer. I knew there was something wrong, and I couldn't put my finger on it with one of our large outsource agreements because the SLAs were all green, right? But that's what they call watermelon SLAs. One day, everything stopped, right? Just like that. So basically, you want to know who has a right to make changes, who has the right to turn things off, how deeply can you look into their models, what will they share with you on the testing? How often do they test and who tests it? Like there's a lot of considerations here in contracting when there's use of AI. And I would recommend that you really, rather than just relying on your standard contracts, start to work with your internal experts, probably some external experts, and your general counsel's office to put together some schedules that you want to negotiate into your contracts that deal with these things, because your standard contracts aren't going to cover the things that are going to that could possibly come back and cause you serious problems.
Can AI systems integrate with existing third-party risk management platforms and tools?
Oh, easily. That's a no-brainer, right? So at the end of the day, you do have to be concerned about APIs, right? So the APIs are the connectors, as we know, between different applications and systems. And so you want to make sure that they're secure and they are doing what they're supposed to do. But basically, I mean, I think that AI is a really easy way to skip by some of the deep integrations and implementations that companies get into. In my role as chief procurement officer, I mean, the dreaded no longer in maintenance for a major system was one of the things we always had to worry about from a budget and a process perspective, because if you're relying on large systems that are fully integrated, I I know it's tempting to do that because it looks good because it's all integrated, but AI can help you skip over some of those steps and not get embroiled in these massive, very often failed large scale implementations. I think it's a good use of the tech.
What are the main risks or concerns with using AI in third-party risk?
I think the number one risk is model risk, to tell you the truth. I think that because AI actually, as I said, is this combination of technologies and of the models themselves and the algorithms that run them, a lot of people kind of skip over that and don't necessarily think about, well, how did these work? And so understanding the underlying model to the best of your ability, because their secret sauce, is an area that's, I think, under-resourced when it comes to third-party risk management, and that we really need to take much more seriously, because it can produce unexpected outcomes. So you want to know how the models are developed, how they maintain the models, what happens if they make changes to models, what happens if it's a learning machine, right? So if it's able to train itself and to learn, one of the things that I'm beginning to think about, which I hardly know what to think about, is quantum computing, right? Where you have, Microsoft was saying that they have computers that are not attached, that can speak to each other, which is interesting. And so when you've got these very complex technologies that are getting more complex every day, understanding to the best of your ability how they work and being curious. I mean, that's number one. Ask a lot of questions, because you might turn up something that you hadn't really thought of, and you probably will turn up something you hadn't really thought of if you ask enough questions. And then it's back to make a risk-informed decision. Are you okay with that?
Can AI help predict the financial stability of third-party vendors?
Thank you for asking that. So in this world, I mean, things are so unstable right now. One of the questions I ask my students every time we hit the financial risk model is whether or not they think that basically that all the ways that we've been looking at the financial viability or the financial risk of a third party is based on historical data. Now, these companies you deal with, some of them do a really great job of analyzing financial statements to predict the potential for future bankruptcy. I think that that's not necessarily going to be enough these days, because what we notice is that because of protectionism around the world, tariffs and rising prices, companies will want to maintain their profit margins to the best of their ability, and that means cutting back on a lot of things. So, some of the things that obviously fall by the wayside are, training and travel. Those are the first two to go all the time. Well, once they start getting into the body of the organization, what goes next? And I think you're going to find that their ability to invest in R&D, their ability to invest in risk management and compliance, those things are going to be increasingly under scrutiny And so companies don't roll back their controls, but maybe new controls are required and they just don't have the capacity to invest in them. So I think that the financial health, we do need to look at impacts of changing trade rules, et cetera, and underlying costs on and determine whether or not that's going to affect entire sectors or geographies, and how. And second thing is to look at the organizations and understand whether or not they continue to invest in risk and compliance.
Awesome. I think we're about out of time. We're going to go to closing remarks now.
Okay, well, thank you. That was interesting for me. Thank you for those questions.
Do you have any closing remarks?
I do. Third-party risk management, it used to be a nice to have, I guess, for a lot of organizations that were not regulated. But I really firmly believe that third-party risk management is an essential capability for organizations. And in fact, it can have a large, not just on their operational resilience, but on their actual survival. So, if you are a third-party risk management professional, bravo. I think you have a long career ahead. And I think if you're not, think about basically what can you do to upskill yourself to where if you're, a lot of the activities you're performing are replaced by AI, how to make sure you continue to be the human in the loop.
Awesome. Thank you for being here, Linda, and thanks to all of you for sharing your time with us today. I think we're out of time.
Okay.
We'll
Thanks,
close.
Steve. Okay, and thanks for everyone for listening. I appreciate it. Okay, enjoy your day. Bye.